Every morning, the richest cowboy in Silver Creek crossed town in the snow for a woman most people barely noticed. The train whistle screamed through the dark, just as Cole Bennett slammed a stack of papers onto the bakery counter. Ruby's hands froze above the flour bowl. Outside, wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the hanging lanterns, but he didn't look away from her once. Then she saw the new sign painted across the wagon behind him, and suddenly the whole town outside seemed very far away. What do you think he brought her? Don't forget to tell me where you're watching from tonight. Before the sun reached the mountains around Silver Creek, Ruby Turner was already awake. The oven behind the station cafe breathed heat into the narrow room while snow pressed softly against the windows. Flour dust clung to the sleeves of her brown dress. Peach pies cooled on the back shelf beside two fresh rye loaves wrapped in cloth. Somewhere outside, a freight train groaned through the valley like an old animal waking from sleep. Ruby opened the cafe door just before dawn. Cold air rolled inside at once. The street beyond was still blue with early light. Snow rested along the wooden porches and fence rails. Across the road, the barber shop remained dark. The general store windows were frosted white. Only the station lantern burned steady beside the tracks. Amos Turner sat near the stove peeling apples with slow hands, worn shiny by age. "You hear that wind?" she asked. Her grandmother nodded without looking up. Storms changing direction. Ruby tied her apron tighter and carried the chalkboard sign outside. Coffee, 5 cents. Peach pie, 10 cents. She had just set it beside the door when she heard hoofbeats. Slow, familiar. Cole Bennett came down Main Street, through the thin morning fog, riding a dark bay horse with snow gathered along its mane. He sat tall in the saddle, broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy wool coat. Folks around Silver Creek spoke his name quietly, like something not meant to be disturbed. Owner of the Bennett Horse Ranch north of the valley. Widower, keeps to himself. Ruby stepped back inside before he reached the porch. The bell above the cafe door rang once as he entered. Heat from the oven touched the snow, melting on his coat. He removed his gloves slowly, eyes moving across the room before settling on her. "Morning," he said. His voice always sounded rough from cold air and long silence. Ruby poured coffee into the same thick white mug she used every morning for him. She wrapped a slice of warm rye bread in cloth and placed it beside the cup. Cole set 2 coins on the counter. "Much appreciated, Mom." There it was again. Mom, not girl, not hey you, not nothing at all. Just enough to make her feel seen for a second, before the feeling slipped away again. He carried his breakfast to the small table near the window. The same. One every morning. Ruby tried not to notice that. Outside, men crossed the street toward the train station with collars raised against the wind. A pair of cattle drivers stomped snow from their boots before entering the saloon farther down the road. Nobody paid much attention to Ruby's cafe most days. But lately they had started looking through the windows. Because of him, Cole ate slowly, never rushed. Sometimes he watched the snow outside while holding the coffee cup in both hands, like the warmth mattered more than the drink itself. Ruby worked quietly behind the counter. Now and then she felt his eyes lift toward her, never long enough to trap her there, just long enough to make her aware of herself. The oven cracked softly behind her. Amos noticed everything and said nothing. By the 3rd week, the town had started talking. Ruby heard it in pieces, at the butcher counter, near the station, outside church. Why's Cole Bennett spending every morning there? He could eat anywhere in town. Clara Whitfield passed the cafe twice one morning, pretending not to look inside. Her father owned the Silver Creek Bank. Most folks assumed she would marry Cole sooner or later. She carried herself like someone already waiting for the answer. Ruby kept her head down and kneaded dough. It was easier that way. One morning, the wind came hard off the mountains. The cafe windows rattled sharply. Snow spun across the road in white sheets. Ruby stepped outside after hearing a loud crack above the porch. The wooden cafe sign had come loose on one side. It swung dangerously over the entrance. She reached up on her toes, trying to grab it, before another gust tore it free completely. The ladder beside the wall was too heavy for her to drag through the snow alone. Then Boots stepped onto the porch behind her. "Hold it steady," Cole said. Before she could answer, he climbed onto the railing and caught the sign with one hand. Wind pushed hard against his coat, while he tightened the loose chain using a small wrench from his saddlebag. Ruby stood below, holding the edge of the board to stop it swinging. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow blew across his shoulders. Her fingers had gone numb from cold. The sign finally settled back into place. Cole stepped down from the railing and brushed snow from his gloves. "That ought to hold now," he said. Ruby looked up at the repaired chain, moving gently in the wind. "You didn't have to stop." He shrugged once. Looked like it needed fixing. Simple as that. Across the street, a carriage had stopped near the dry goods store. Clara Whitfield stood beside it, beneath a dark green coat trimmed with fur. Her eyes moved from Cole to Ruby, to the sign above the cafe door. Then she spoke quietly enough that only Ruby heard her. "A man like him doesn't stop somewhere unless he intends to change something." The wind carried the words between them. Cole either didn't hear or pretended not to. He pulled on his gloves again, tipped his hat once toward Ruby, and walked back toward his horse. Ruby stood alone beneath the repaired sign long after he rode away. For the first time since Cole Bennett had begun coming to her cafe every morning, fear settled softly beside the warmth. The storm rolled through Silver Creek that night and stayed. Snow covered the railroad tracks until only the black steel tops showed through the white. Wagons moved slower. Men stamped their boots harder before entering buildings. The windows of Ruby's cafe fogged thick every morning from the heat of the oven pushing against the cold outside. Still, Cole came. Always before sunrise. Always the same horse. Same coat dusted with snow. Same quiet nod when he stepped through the door. Ruby started hearing the rhythm of him before she saw him. The hitch of leather. The porch creak under his boots. The small pause before the cafe bell rang. One morning he arrived with frost gathered along his beard and placed an extra log beside the stove without explanation. "Wind's turning worse tonight," he said. Ruby glanced at the cedar wood. Most people in town used pine because it burned cheap and fast. Cedar cost more, burned cleaner, held steady heat longer for baking. "You remembered," she said before she meant to. Cole removed his gloves slowly. "You said your bread rises better with cedar. That was all. No smile. No performance." But Ruby stood very still behind the counter after he sat down by the window. Amos noticed. That evening, while kneading dough, Amos spoke without looking up from her apples. "That man listens." Ruby brushed flour from her hands. "Folks listen all the time." "No," Amos said quietly. "Folks wait for their turn to talk." Outside, snow hit the windows in soft bursts. Ruby did not answer. The town had become less quiet about things. Clara Whitfield stopped by the cafe twice that week with women Ruby recognized from church socials and summer picnics. They ordered coffee they barely touched and sat near the front window, speaking just loudly enough. A lonely man can mistake kindness for attachment, especially in winter. Ruby carried plates between tables and acted as though she heard nothing. But afterward, she scrubbed the counter harder than necessary. The next morning, Cole came in later than usual. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat in heavy patches. He looked tired around the eyes. Ruby poured his coffee. "You eat anything yesterday?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She set the cup down carefully. "Course I did." Cole looked once toward the untouched biscuit beside the register. Ruby followed his eyes. She had forgotten it was there. Without a word, he pushed his plate toward her. Half the eggs untouched, 2 strips of bacon still warm. Her face warmed immediately. "I can feed myself." "I know," he said. Then he looked back out the window as if the matter had already passed. Ruby stood there another second before carrying the plate into the kitchen. She ate one bite leaning against the counter while the oven crackled behind her. That evening, the storm worsened. A freight wagon carrying flour got stuck near the eastern road. Ruby waited until nearly dark before realizing her delivery had not arrived. The cafe would not last 3 more days without flour. She pulled on her coat and stepped into knee-deep snow behind the building where the supply sacks had been left beneath a canvas tarp. The wind nearly tore the lantern from her hand. One sack slipped while she dragged it toward the back door. 50 pounds dead weight against frozen ground. Her boots slid hard beneath her. Then another pair of hands caught the top of the sack. Coal. Ruby startled so sharply she nearly dropped the lantern. "What are you doing here?" Train agent said. "Your delivery got dumped behind the station." Snow blew between them in sharp white streaks. Cole lifted the sack easily and carried it inside before she could argue. The warm air hit both of them at once. Ruby shut the door quickly behind him. For a moment, neither spoke. Snow melted slowly from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floorboards. Cole carried the flour sack into storage and set it down carefully beside the others. "You shouldn't be hauling these alone." Ruby crossed her arms tight against the cold still trapped in her coat. "I manage. I know you do." There was no pity in it. That made it worse somehow. She looked away first. Cole noticed the slight shake in her hands while she relit the lantern near the stove. Without a word, he reached toward the oven and fed another cedar log into the firebox. The flames steadied at once. Ruby watched him from across the room. Most men made noise when helping, wanted thanks, wanted to be seen doing it. Cole only pulled his gloves back on. At the door, he paused. "Storm'll freeze the north road by morning," he said. "Lock the back gate tonight." Then he left. Ruby stood in the kitchen, listening to his horse disappear into the snow. The next morning, his table by the window stayed empty. She noticed immediately and hated herself for it. By noon, the rye loaf she usually wrapped for him still sat beneath the counter untouched. She told herself was busy. By evening, she had reheated the coffee pot twice without reason. Outside, darkness settled early over Silver Creek. The station whistle echoed low across the valley. Ruby was wiping down the counter when the delivery boy burst through the cafe door, breathing hard clouds into the warm room. "Miss Turner," he said quickly. "Mr. Bennett got thrown from his horse up north yesterday." The rag stopped moving in Ruby's hand. The boy swallowed hard. "Folks say he's been laid up at the ranch house with fever since last night." Behind her, the oven fire cracked sharply. Ruby did not move. For one long second, the whole room seemed to narrow around the sound of the wind outside and the untouched rye bread beneath the counter. The delivery boy shifted awkwardly near the door. "They say Doc Harlan hasn't been able to get up there yet," he added. "North Road's near buried." Ruby finally looked at him. "Who's taking care of the horses?" The boy blinked. "Don't know, Mom." He left a moment later, carrying cold air out with him. The cafe fell quiet again, except for the stove ticking softly. Amos watched Ruby from her chair near the fire. "You're thinking about going." Ruby untied her apron slowly. Someone ought to check on him. Amos nodded once, like she had already known the answer before the question finished forming. Outside, snow kept falling. Ruby packed broth into a tin container and wrapped 2 small jars of willow bark tonic in cloth. She pulled on her thickest coat, the dark blue one, with the missing button near the collar. By the time she stepped outside with the lantern, the station clock read nearly 8. The road north of Silver Creek disappeared under white drifts. Her boots sank deep, with every step beside the borrowed mule cart. Wind pushed hard against her shoulders as she climbed toward the Bennett Ranch. The ranch house finally appeared through the storm almost an hour later. Large, dark, sitting alone against the mountain like something abandoned. Only one upstairs window showed light. Ruby tied the mule near the barn and hurried across the porch. Snow had drifted halfway against the front steps. Inside, the house smelled faintly of smoke and fever. Cole lay upstairs beneath heavy blankets, half turned toward the wall. A lamp burned low beside the bed. His face looked sharper than usual. Color drained beneath the dark stubble along his jaw. A basin of water sat untouched nearby. Ruby set the broth down quietly and crossed to the window first. She cracked it slightly to let the stale heat escape. Cole stirred at the sound. For a second, his eyes opened halfway, not fully seeing her. "Claire," he murmured hoarsely. Ruby froze. His dead wife. The name hung softly in the room before the fever pulled him under again. Ruby looked away and rolled up her sleeves. The next 3 days blurred together beneath storm clouds and lamplight. She fed the stove through the nights to keep the pipes from freezing, carried buckets from the pump when the kitchen water ran low, rubbed down the horses herself after hearing them restless in the barn during the worst of the wind. Cole drifted in and out of fever sleep. Sometimes he knew where he was, sometimes he didn't. Once near dawn he tried getting out of bed, mumbling about loose fencing near the north ridge. Ruby pressed both hands against his shoulders to steady him. "You're not riding anywhere," she said quietly. His eyes met hers then, clear for only a second, but enough. He looked at her like a man returning from someplace far away. That same night the storm hit hardest. Snow hammered against the windows. The whole ranch house groaned under the wind. Ruby sat beside the bed, replacing the cold cloth along Cole's forehead when suddenly his hand closed around her wrist. Strong, even sick. "Don't go," he whispered. Ruby's breath caught. He never opened his eyes. Still, he held onto her hand like a drowning man, holding the edge of something solid. She stayed there until his grip loosened again. By the third morning, the fever finally broke. Ruby noticed it first in the silence. His breathing changed. Slower now, easier. Light from the snowy hills slipped pale through the bedroom curtains, while the fire burned low behind her. Cole opened his eyes fully this time. He looked at her sitting beside the bed, with tired shadows beneath her eyes and flour still caught near one sleeve of her coat. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his gaze drifted past her toward the room. The empty chair, the cold coffee cup beside the lamp. Proof someone had remained there through the night. "You stayed," he said quietly. Ruby lowered her eyes at once. No one had ever said those words to her, like they mattered. She stood too quickly and reached for the empty basin just to have something in her hands. "You needed looking after." Cole watched her cross the room. Near the dresser drawer, partly left open, Ruby caught sight of a tiny child's scarf folded neatly beneath old papers. Pink wool. Carefully kept. Downstairs, the dining table held only one chair pulled out beside a cold plate from days earlier. The whole ranch house carried that same feeling. Not messy, not uncared for, just lonely. By afternoon, the storm finally weakened. Ruby packed her things before sunset. Cole was downstairs by then, pale but standing. He leaned one shoulder against the kitchen doorway while she buttoned her coat. "You don't have to ride back tonight," he said. Ruby slipped on her gloves slowly. Town's already talking. Something moved briefly across his face at that. Not anger, something quieter. "I'm sorry for that." She looked at him then. Cole Bennett was not a man who apologized easily. You could hear it in the way the words settled unevenly between them. Ruby shook her head once. "You didn't do anything wrong." Outside, the snow had stopped. The mountains looked sharp and blue beneath the evening sky. Ruby climbed into the mule cart and started down the road toward Silver Creek. The town appeared below an hour later with chimney smoke curling into the dark. People noticed her before she reached Main Street. She saw it happen one face at a time. The barber pausing outside his shop. Two women near the mercantile lowering their voices. Sheriff Dalton Reeves standing near the saloon doors with his eyes following the cart. Ruby kept her hand steady on the reins. But when she passed the station window and caught her reflection in the glass, she understood something had changed. Silver Creek knew exactly where she had spent the last 3 nights, and the way people looked at her now was no longer simple curiosity. Ruby felt it the moment she reopened the cafe the next morning. Conversation lowered when she entered rooms. Men who once barely noticed her now tipped their hats too carefully. Women paused half a second, too long before taking their coffee. Outside, wagon wheels dragged through dirty snow left behind by the storm. The station bell rang somewhere down the tracks while smoke drifted low above the rooftops. Ruby kept her hands moving. Flour, dough, coffee, plates. That was easier than thinking. Amos sat near the stove, shelling pecans into a bowl. "Town'll tire itself eventually," she said quietly. Ruby folded a towel beside the counter. "Maybe," but she did not sound convinced. Cole returned 2 mornings later. The cafe door opened and cold air moved through the room ahead of him. He looked thinner than before the fever, slower too. One hand remained stiff near his side as though the fall still hurt him when he moved wrong. Ruby felt her chest tighten before she could stop it. He noticed the fresh bandage wrapped around her wrist where boiling water had splashed the night before. "You burn yourself." She pulled her sleeve down slightly, just careless. Cole stood there another second, like he wanted Hugh to say more. Instead, he removed his gloves and sat by the window. The same table, the same coffee cup. Only now the whole room seemed aware of it. Ruby brought him his rye bread without meeting his eyes. "Much appreciated, Mom," he said softly. But something had changed inside the words now. People heard it too. By the end of the week, Clara Whitfield stopped pretending. She arrived at the cafe one afternoon, wrapped in a cream-colored coat with silver buttons shining against the snowlight. 2 women followed behind her, carrying shopping parcels. Clara did not sit. She stood near the counter, looking around the small cafe with polite disappointment. "It must have been difficult up there at the ranch," she said lightly. "All alone during a storm." Ruby continued slicing bread. "The roads were dangerous," Clara added. "People can misunderstand things so easily." One of the women lowered her eyes into her coffee. Ruby finally looked up. "Mr. Bennett was sick." "Yes," Clara said, "and very fortunate someone was willing to forget propriety long enough to help." The cafe went still. Ruby placed the knife down carefully beside the cutting board. "I'd do the same again." Clara smiled then, small, sharp around the edges. "That's exactly what worries people." She left without buying anything. That night, Ruby sat alone after closing while the stove settled into low red coals. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof edges. Amos folded receipts near the register and finally said, "You thinking about leaving?" Ruby stared at the empty coffee cup Cole had used that morning. "I don't know what I'm thinking anymore." The winter festival arrived the following Saturday. Lanterns hung across Main Street, throwing gold light onto packed snow. Someone played fiddle music near the auction tables, while ranch hands laughed beside whiskey barrels set outside the saloon. Ruby almost did not go, but Amos insisted. "Can't spend your whole life hiding in kitchens." So Ruby wore her dark green dress beneath her wool coat and carried 2 trays of fresh peach pies to the charity auction near the church square. At first, things stayed peaceful. Children chased each other between lantern posts. Horses snorted clouds into the cold night air. Men bid loudly over smoked ham and preserves, while Sheriff Dalton Reeves watched from near the courthouse steps. Then Clara Whitfield approached the auction table. She lifted one of Ruby's pie plates delicately. "I heard you used to work in Kansas before coming here." Ruby kept arranging the plates. "For a railway cafe," Clara continued, "until money went missing." The square quieted in pieces around them. Ruby's fingers stopped moving. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Terrible misunderstanding, I'm sure." Sheriff Reeves shifted nearby but said nothing. People were watching openly now. Ruby felt heat rise into her face despite the cold air. She had spent years burying that story beneath work and silence. The railway owner's nephew had stolen from the register. Ruby had been blamed because no one important cared enough to ask questions twice. She swallowed once. "I don't owe this town my past." "No," Clara said softly. "But men like Cole Bennett do have reputations to protect." That was the moment boots sounded sharply across the snow behind them. Cole. He came through the crowd wearing a black wool coat dusted with frost. Conversations fell apart around him almost immediately. He looked first at Ruby. Not the crowd. Not Clara. Ruby stood very still beneath the lantern light, holding the edge of the table hard enough. Her knuckles had gone pale. Cole's jaw tightened once. Then he stepped beside her. close enough that everyone in Silver Creek could see exactly where he chose to stand. "That woman worked harder than half the men in this town," he said evenly. No shouting. That somehow made it stronger. The square went silent, except for the fiddle player slowly lowering his bow. Cole reached into his coat pocket and set folded bills onto the auction table. "I'll take every pie she brought." Clara's face lost color. Ruby looked at him in disbelief. Cole did not look away from the crowd. "Anybody got a problem with that?" he said quietly. "They can bring it to me." No one moved. Not Sheriff Reeves, not Clara, not a single man near the whiskey barrels. Cole gathered the pie boxes himself and carried them toward his wagon. Ruby stood frozen beneath the lanterns while snow drifted softly through the yellow light around her. For the first time in years, someone had chosen her openly, and somehow that frightened her even more than being alone ever had. Late that night, she returned to the cafe exhausted and cold. She unlocked the front door expecting darkness. Instead, she found Amos sitting at the counter holding a paper receipt beneath the lamp. Ruby frowned. "What's that?" Amos slid the document across the wood silently. Ruby picked it up, paid in full. 3 months overdue rent on the cafe building, settled that very evening. No signature, no explanation. But near the bottom sat the clean ink stamp from Bennett Mercantile Supply. Ruby stared at the receipt while the lamp flame trembled slightly beside her. Outside, somewhere far down the dark road north of town, a horse moved through the snow toward the lonely ranch on the hill. She did not sleep much that night. The paper stayed folded beneath the coffee tin beside the register, while the stove burned low and steady. Every time Ruby closed her eyes, she saw Cole standing beside her in the town square, calm, certain. Like choosing her in front of everyone had cost him nothing at all. But she knew better. Silver Creek did not forgive people for crossing the lines it had drawn, especially men like Cole Bennett. Before dawn, Ruby tied on her apron and began the morning bread. The cafe smelled of yeast and cinnamon while pale blue light gathered outside the station windows. Amos was still asleep in the back room. Ruby placed the rye loaf on the counter automatically, then stopped herself. For several seconds, she stared at the empty place beside it where his coffee cup usually waited. She wrapped the loaf anyway. The morning train arrived just after 7. Cowboys from the Eastern Valley crowded the cafe with snow still melting from their boots. A cattle broker from Helena complained about frozen roads while Ruby refilled coffee without listening closely. Near the front window, 2 women lowered their voices when she passed. "She'll leave before spring," one whispered. "She'd have to." Ruby carried another pot to the stove and pretended not to hear. Cole did not come that morning, or the next. By the 3rd day, Ruby felt herself listening for hoofbeats, even while kneading dough in the kitchen. It angered her, not at him, at herself. Late Friday afternoon, she climbed the narrow stairs to the room behind the cafe and pulled her old traveling case from beneath the bed. The leather straps had cracked near the corners from years of use. Kansas dust still clung faintly inside the seams. Amos watched from the doorway without speaking. Ruby folded 2 dresses carefully into the case. "I can't stay here waiting for the town to decide what kind of woman I am." Amos crossed the room slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. "You leaving because of them?" she asked softly. "Or because of him?" Ruby's hands stopped moving. Outside, wagon wheels rolled slowly through melting snow. Somewhere down the street, a hammer struck wood in steady rhythm. "He deserves peace," Ruby said finally. Amos looked at her a long moment. "And what do you deserve?" Ruby did not answer. The train heading west left at sunrise Monday morning. She bought her tickets Saturday afternoon from the station clerk. Denver, one way. The small paper receipt stayed tucked inside her coat pocket all weekend. Sunday passed gray and quiet. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the cafe roof. Mud gathered thick along Main Street. Church bells echoed through town while Ruby worked longer hours than necessary just to avoid thinking. That evening, she locked the cafe door and turned down the lamps one by one. Then she heard wheels outside. A wagon, Not fast, not hurried. Ruby looked through the front window. Cole Bennett sat on the driver's bench of an old work wagon, with snow mud drying along the wheels. One lantern hung beside him, throwing warm light across the dark street. He stepped down slowly when she opened the door. For a second, neither spoke. Cole looked tired, not sick anymore, just worn in the way winter wears a man down from the inside. I heard you bought a train ticket, he said. Ruby folded her arms against the cold. Town talks too much. Yes, he said quietly. It does. Wind moved softly through the empty street behind him. Ruby looked past him toward the dark outline of the mountains. I don't belong here anymore. Cole studied her face for a long moment before speaking again. There's something I need you to see first. That was all. No speech, no pleading. Ruby should have said no. Instead, she grabbed her coat from the wall hook and followed him outside. The wagon rolled north through wet snow beneath a sky heavy with low clouds. Lantern light swung softly over the road while the horses breathed white into the dark. Neither of them spoke much. Once Cole pulled his gloves off briefly to adjust the reins, and Ruby noticed the healing scrape along his knuckles from the fall. Small things like that had started hurting her lately. The wagon finally turned near the river road below his ranch. Ruby frowned slightly. This isn't the way to your house. No, Cole said. A few minutes later, the wagon stopped beside a small wooden building near the frozen creek. Fresh pine boards, new roof, warm light glowing through the front window. Ruby climbed down slowly. Above the porch hung a painted sign, Turner Bakery and Coffee House. She stopped breathing for a second. Cole opened the door quietly and stepped aside for her to enter first. The smell hit her immediately. Brick dust, fresh wood, cedar smoke. A real bakery oven stood along the far wall. Wide counters stretched beneath the windows. New shelves lined the back room, waiting for flour jars and pie tins and cooling racks. Ruby moved through the space slowly, like someone afraid to wake from a dream. Her fingertips brushed the smooth wood counter. You said your old oven couldn't hold heat long enough for sourdough, Cole said behind her. Ruby turned toward him. When did you? Months ago. The room fell quiet, except for the crackle of fire inside the brick oven. Ruby looked around again, the care in it listening inside every detail, not fancy, not showy, just solid, thoughtful, permanent. You bought this? Cole nodded once. For you. Ruby shook her head slowly, overwhelmed already. Cole, you deserved something nobody could take from you. The words settled into the warm room between them. Ruby lowered her face immediately, because suddenly she could not hold herself together anymore. All those years scraping by, being overlooked, being temporary everywhere she went. And this man had listened closely enough to build her a future with his own hands. Cole stood still for a long moment before speaking again. I'm tired of eating alone. Ruby laughed softly through tears she could no longer hide. Then she crossed the room and wrapped both arms around him. Cole held her carefully at first, like he still wasn't entirely certain she would stay. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the roof edge into the dark river below while warm light filled the bakery windows for the very first time. And somewhere beyond the frozen hills around Silver Creek, winter finally began letting go. Maybe that's what stays with people after stories like this. Not the grand moments, not the gossip in town, not even the wedding bells drifting through the valley that's spring. It's the quieter things. A man showing up every morning when nobody asked him to. A woman setting aside the warmest loaf without ever speaking her heart out loud. Two lonely people learning that love sometimes arrives softly and stays by doing small things over and over again. And if you've ever sat alone at a kitchen table after everyone else went home, if you've ever convinced yourself that your best years were already behind you, then maybe you understand why that little bakery mattered so much. Because deep down, most people are not searching for riches. They're searching for a place where they can finally rest without feeling unwanted. Cole gave Ruby more than a building. He gave her something steady enough to trust. And maybe that's what healing really looks like. If this story stayed with you tonight, Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, or who in your life once made you feel seen when the world didn't. And if you'd like, stay a while longer on this trail with us. There are still more stories waiting beyond the mountains. Stories about broken hearts finding home, old promises kept alive, and people discovering light where they least expected it.